McQueen. My sign is on the table there. It's my pleasure and privilege to be your chair this evening, in which capacity I assure you that I will trouble you but little. But it's my pleasant task to welcome you to the rooms of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which are this week hosting the British Academy's Medieval Week. This is the second evening. Those of you who were here last night will have heard a ringing affirmation of the fact that medievalists are not just ornamental, and I'm sure this evening is going to confirm us in that perspective. We've got a splendid evening. I think, looking at it very much from the outside, as it were, the core of the evening is going to be two heroic figures from Scottish and Welsh history, but I've really no idea of what angles are going to emerge from it, and I'm looking forward to an interesting evening. We're going to follow the same format as last night. That is to say, the initial part of the evening is a conversation between two very distinguished historians whom I will introduce in a moment, and then we have at 7 o'clock or thereby a lecture, a full-blown lecture from another very distinguished scholar, but this time visiting us from Wales. So we're looking forward very much to these two elements. Will there be a small comfort break in the middle, which I'm told is not to exceed 8 minutes, so I'll be timing you very, very carefully. That's probably my most oppressive act as chairman, to reconvene you at the 8th minute. But if you're forewarned, you can take appropriate steps when the time comes. Now, the first part of this evening involves, on my left, my far left, Professor Dauvit Broun of the University of Glasgow, and on my near left, Professor Alexander Broadie, also of the University of Glasgow. They're very well known in Scotland and beyond. They cover an enormous range of history between them. I'm looking forward very much indeed to what they have to say on Robert the Brus, in Scottish sources before Barbour's Brus. I think the format will be that Davy will speak first, and then he will be interrogated by Alexander, which should be fun, and I'm going therefore to return to the seats and watch as a member of the audience. The show will be run by Alexander.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. So you're going to have to put up with me for 20 minutes, and then Professor Broadie will be in charge, and I'll be at the receiving end, and then I believe the floor will be open to your good selves. When I was asked to give a brief talk to precede Professor Griffith Aled Williams's lecture on poetry relating to Owain Glyndŵr, the hero of Welsh aspirations to independence following the English conquest of the country, my mind turned naturally to Robert Brus, who vindicated Scottish independence following the conquest of Scotland by Edward I in 1304. There are obvious differences between the two. When Owain Glyndŵr served the English crown early in his career, he was not standing against his fellow countrymen. One of his assignments, for example, was as a member of the English garrison at Berwick-upon-Tweed in 1384. When Robert Brus joined forces with Edward I, by contrast, he turned his arms against those fighting for independent Scotland. When Owain Glyndŵr began his revolt in 1400, he'd been head of his family for more than 30 years. Robert Brus started planning his coup within weeks of his father's death on 21st April 1304. And of course, when Owain Glyndŵr rose against the English, Wales had been occupied for over a century, and his struggle for independence eventually failed. Robert Brus's rising in 1306 was only 2 years after the government, led by John Comyn in the name of the absent King John Balliol, had finally surrendered to Edward I. And, as we all know, Robert Brus succeeded during his reign in securing formal recognition of Scotland as a sovereign kingdom by the King of England and by the Pope, even though this proved worthless in preventing another English invasion within years of his death. Another important difference is in the literature about them that survives from their own lifetimes. Here, Any smugness that we Scots may feel in contrasting our fortunes with Wales is swiftly undermined. There is a wonderful wealth of surviving medieval Welsh poetry that was written and to be performed in front of lords not only of national importance but local too. Owain Glyndŵr was one of those lords. The poetry addressed to him, therefore, allows us to come into his court and catch something of its conventions and atmosphere, its aspirations and concerns. Almost no vernacular literature survives from the courts of medieval Scotland until some time after Brus's death, and then chiefly from the Highlands. The first extant vernacular poem composed for the benefit of the king and his entourage is the magnificent account of the wars fought by Robert Brus and his principal captains, written in Scots by John Barbour in 1375 or 1376. And this is the source of the quotation in my title. As far as anything written for Brus's own ears is concerned, there is little more than the Latin poem on the Battle of Bannockburn, written by the poet who Edward II had brought with him in order to memorialise in verse what he assumed would be a glorious English victory. The hapless poet was captured by Brus's forces during the fray and was soon obliged to display his creative versatility by composing a suitable poem of celebration for his new patrons. In the case of Owain Glyndŵr, there is even poetry associated with him before he began his revolt, quite a lot, as we're going to find out. Needless to say, there is no verse that survives that was written specifically for Robert Brus before he seized the throne in 1306. If we extend our search to anything in literature written about him by a Scot before he began his career as the nation's liberator, all I can suggest is a single, rather difficult allusion to him in a poetic history of Scotland, in Latin, written not long before Brus's coup in 1306. And if my interpretation of these lines is right, it puts Brus in a very different light from being a national hero. So let us look more closely at this work. In the poem's account of the sack of Berwick by Edward I on 30th March 1296, mention is made of, and here's the quote, "the treachery of a certain man who will be decried forever, whose banner deceived the citizens of Berwick. Let the name of this earl be concealed, lest damage be renewed." And you'll see that nobody's actually named, of course. There were only 3 Scottish earls serving Edward I at this time. The only one who seems to fit the strange injunction that his name should be concealed in case damage be renewed is the Earl of Carrick, Robert Brus, the future king. It is clear elsewhere in the poem that the author was a patriot, writing during a period of English occupation, probably after the conquest of 1304. After the deposition of John Balliol, he declared, very graphically, "Thus far, kings had all been Scots like their people. And if God grants it, may it be henceforth just as it was before. When a body has an alien head, it is all filth. So, a people is defiled when a foreigner becomes king." The foreign king is presumably Edward I. The poet was not only a patriot, but rejected the Brus claim to the throne. This is made explicit in his account of the dispute between John Balliol and Robert Brus's grandfather about who should be king following the extinction of the royal line in 1290, a dispute settled in the Great Cause, or Great Court case, if you like, of 1291-2, presided over by Edward I. In the poem, Balliol's right is said to be according to the law of the Scots, which they had brought with them from Egypt. Now, you cannot give a claim greater validity than that. Our author was not necessarily a blinkered partisan of the Balliol cause, however. According to my interpretation of the opaque reference to a treacherous earl at the fall of Berwick, he seems to have been wary of antagonising the Brus party unduly, although at the same time not forgetting Robert Brus's alleged dastardly deed. Presumably, the damage he was afraid of renewing was disunity and conflict between Scotland's leading families. He would not have been the only patriot who decried division as inevitably leading to suffering and defeat. Another chronicler, looking back on the beginning of the war with Edward I, when the cause of independence was led by the Commons in the name of King John Balliol, observed, that just as afterwards, when King Robert Brus was making war, all the supporters of Balliol were suspected of treason in his war, so also in this Balliol's war, all the supporters of Brus's party were generally considered traitors to the king and kingdom. But alas, through discord of this kind, the innocent masses were exposed to the frenzied bites of wolves and lay lacerated through the length and breadth of the land. The same writer also observed ruefully that it should be noted that we rarely if ever read that Scots were overcome by the English except as a result of jealousy among their leaders or by guile and deceit on the part of natives going over to the other side. When he mentioned jealousy among their leaders, he must have had in mind the rivalry between Brus and his supporters and Balliol and his supporters, notably the Commons. Spot the difference. One is Brus and one is Glyndŵr. When thinking about what I might offer as a Scottish counterpoint to Professor Williams's lecture, I soon realised that if I were to match his emphasis chiefly on Owain Glyndŵr before his revolt by focusing on Brus before his coup in 1306, then my talk would be painfully brief. I'd be leaving the platform right now. Instead, I decided to extend my range to include literature written in Scotland before Barbour wrote the Brus in 1375 or 1376. Barbour's Brus soon came to dominate the way Robert Brus was portrayed in subsequent writing in the vernacular. Andrew of Winton, who sometime between 1408 and 1424 wrote a universal history in Scots, focusing on Scotland only when he reached the Central Middle Ages, famously declined to say much about Robert I, directing his readers instead to Barbour's Brus. This was not the case in Scottish histories written in Latin, a point which I'll return to briefly at the end. Although Robert Brus is very far from being presented by Barbour as an identikit hero king, the poem is in fact remarkable for its complex portrayal of the struggle for independence. There is no doubt that our own image of Robert Brus as the nation's liberator owes much to Barbour. Only one substantial work on the Wars of Independence written in Scotland before Barbour's Brus can be recovered. Its identity, however, is difficult to establish because it is hidden, as it were, in another text. Before talking about it at all, therefore, we must spend some time in trying to rescue it. Now, this is going to be slightly hard for the next 2 minutes, so ready to go. The work in question survives only in some manuscripts of Forden's History of the Scottish People, a text which runs in 5 books from Scottish origins to the death of David I in 1153, and was finished in its extant form sometime between 1384 and 1387. So that's Forden's Chronicle to one side. In some manuscripts of Forden's Chronicle, the final book is followed by material, which W.F. Skene, Forden's editor, called simply Gesterinalia, Yearly Deeds. This originally ran up to 1363, with a sporadic continuation to 1385 in a couple of manuscripts. The first step to recovering our text is to examine 3 aspects of Gesterinalia. This is where I'm sparing you a lot of painful but frankly necessary detail. So the first step, the disposition of Gesterinalia in the manuscripts. Second, the pattern of sources that have been used in Gesterinalia. And thirdly, the overlap with summary chronicles from the late 14th century which are closely related to it. These all 3 considerations show that Gesterinalia consisted originally of 2 separate works. One extended to 1285, the other, which I will call very imaginatively Gesterinalia II, dealt with a period to 1363. Right, give you a bit of a hand with the next bits, which are the crucial bits. So if you're still with me, the next step is to look more closely at Gesterinalia II. That is the material from 1285 to 1363. Now, if you looked at this closely, you'd see there's a curious chronological overlap in the period from Alexander III's death in 1286 to the inauguration of John Balliol in 1292. We basically get it twice. You get it at the beginning, and then from 81 you start again. The numbers in bold are the chapter numbers given by Skene in his edition. Now, the simplest explanation for this curious overlap would be that initially the material from 1285 was continued to the competition for the throne between Brus and Balliol, finishing with a discussion of their ancestry and an account of the descent of David II and Edward III. There are hints that the genealogical material was written sometime in the 1350s. Then a wholly separate work, this is the one we're interested in, from 1286 to 1363 was later added by way of a further continuation. And finally, the final stage would then have been the intrusion of some pro-Brus material, which is also found in the account of events in 1306 and also in 1272. And this pro-Brus material is closely related to similar stories in Barbour's Brus. So, the originally separate work from 1286 to 1363 is the history that we're interested in. We must note, however, that it has not come down to us exactly as its author has left it. For instance, as I've just noted, it has become entangled with a pro-Brus narrative in its account of the killing of John Comyn in February 1306. Once this has been removed, there is no immediate cause to doubt that we are looking at a single text. But I must warn you that the painstaking work of editing this material afresh has yet to be undertaken, so my conclusions are provisional. As things stand, the original work would appear to have been written at St Andrews, in or sometime after 1363. And Dr Steve Boardman has made an attractive suggestion that its author may have been Thomas Bissett, prior of St Andrews, who retired from his posts in 1363. Now, we have, in fact, already met this text in the quotations about the perils of disunity and the lamentable division between Brus and Balliol/Comyn. The most notable characteristic of the work is that it shows a passionate commitment to Scottish independence, combined with a real concern for the plight of ordinary people. One example of this particular sympathy with the lot of ordinary Scots is in the obituary of Andrew Murray. To anyone committed to Scottish independence, Andrew Murray would have been a hero. Between 1335 and 1338, he defeated the Scottish leaders backed by Edward III and won back most of Scotland from English occupation. And yet, the author of this work is not unqualified in his praise, but notes, dryly, that the great Andrew Murray killed more Scots than English, a reference to the brutal policy of destroying the countryside in order to prevent the enemy from finding food and supplies, which rather meant that nobody else living there could find food or supplies either. Right, what we're interested in today, however, is in the portrayal of Robert Brus in this text. From the moment that Brus is crowned, he is presented in exaggerated, heroic terms. So everything is okay so far. And yet, there is a surprise. The battle that is given the most attention is not the Battle of Bannockburn. About Bannockburn, we are told simply that Robert, putting his trust in God, came with only a few men against Edward II and put him to flight. The only specific information that's provided is that one very prominent English noble was killed and that another was captured and was among those hostages exchanged for Robert's queen and the Bishop of Glasgow, who had languished in English captivity since 1306. In marked contrast, the Battle of Roslin, fought on 24th February 1303, is described in vivid detail. I know some of you will have heard of the Battle of Roslin, but I doubt all of you. We are told, in this account of the battle, how John Comyn and Simon Fraser, with a small force, sped overnight from Biggar and caught 3 battalions of English unawares south of Edinburgh. How they fought first one battalion, then another, each time thinking they had won a victory, only to find that they faced a more severe challenge, until at last the 3rd and final battalion was overcome. Before the last battalion was faced, John Comyn and Simon Fraser are described giving a rousing speech to their men, I quote, reminding them of the nobility of freedom and the shame of subjection, and of the tireless labours freely undertaken by their ancestors and themselves for the liberation of their country. End of quote. No such speech is accorded to Brus in this work. Not only that, but the Battle of Roslin is introduced with a heightened account of how John Comyn and Simon Fraser had been the stalwart defenders of Scottish freedom throughout Edward I's depredations, and how they had resisted the English and Anglified Scots, Scoti Anglicati, for years. The effect of this, in the work as a whole, is that although Brus's personal sacrifices and hardships for Scottish independence and his achievements are celebrated, the characters who are portrayed most memorably as champions of the Scottish cause are John Comyn and Simon Fraser, more so even than William Wallace. It does not seem to have mattered that a year after the Battle of Roslin, Edward I conquered Scotland again. This historical text, difficult though it is to recover, reveals that Brus and Wallace were not the only heroes who were celebrated by Scottish patriots before Barbour wrote his account of the Brus. There was not only Simon Fraser, who fought for both Balliol and Brus, but above all John Comyn, who was killed by Robert Brus in the church of the Greyfriars, Dumfries, on 5th February 1306. By this dreadful deed, Brus ensured that the Comyns, the most powerful family in Scotland, and their relatives and close associates, numbering many of the highest-ranking noblemen, would be his implacable enemies. As a result, the Comyns and their allies were immortalised in Barbour's Brus and subsequent histories as opponents of Scottish independence. As late as the 1360s, however, it was evidently still possible for someone writing about this period to retain not only an even-handed view of Comyn as well as Brus as contributing vitally to the cause of independence, but even to give more of the limelight to John Comyn. It was only with Barbour's Brus that this began to change, though in histories written in Latin, the prose of our author writing in St Andrews in 1363 or thereafter lived on in Bowers' Scotichronicon, written in the 1440s, where the account of the Battle of Roslin is repeated with minimal alteration. To finish, I would like to turn not to history writing, but to another form of commemoration, the events recorded in a calendar for prayer and formal remembrance. One of the liturgical books of Aberdeen Cathedral from the late 14th century survives in Edinburgh University Library. It includes a calendar, and into this calendar a scribe near the end of the 14th century has inserted a series of events to be marked each year in the cathedral. And his dates show that he took the 25th of March, not the 1st of January, as the beginning of the year. What is striking is that just as in our text, written probably at St Andrews in or shortly after 1363, the significant events of the war feature both Brus and Comyn. The fact that this even-handedness can be detected in Aberdeen, as well as probably St Andrews, suggests that, before Barbour's Brus, there was a significant body of patriotic opinion that refused to treat Brus as the hero at the expense of Comyn. The Battle of Roslin was treasured not because of its significance in achieving independence, which it signally failed to do, but because it called to mind John Comyn's contribution to the cause of independence, as well as Simon Fraser's. It was only after Barbour's Brus that our modern image of Robert Brus as the nation's liberator and of Bannockburn as the iconic battle of the war seems to have begun to gather momentum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I've been scribbling notes while you've been speaking, and there are perhaps one or two questions or comments I would like to make, and I can live with it if you just dismiss them all straight to the boundary. But there's one thing that struck me as perhaps a gap in your representation of the situation, which is rather spectacular, and that is that whereas on the one hand you make very clear the point that Welsh and Scottish sources are very disparate in the sense that Wales, bless it, is awash with sources for this period. And speaking about Glyndŵr in particular, Scotland is impoverished in that field, and I do think that that's an area that might be worth exploring just for a minute or two. And there are one or two thoughts I've got about this without expanding very far. First of all, you make several references to to Brus as the Earl of Carrick. This, I think, is through his mother, who was a major figure in the Gaelic part of Scottish society, and he was a half Gael. And one might well have thought in those circumstances that Gaelic literature itself would throw up a certain amount of material in due course on Brus. And I'm really rather surprised that nothing of that has come to light. And I know, of course, that it was overwhelmingly an oral tradition, but then there were all sorts of things in the Gaelic part of Scotland that were known orally that eventually got written down, and one would want to know why, if in fact there had been material on Brus in the oral tradition, that does not subsequently appear. While a second thought is momentarily in my head, I'd like to grab it before it vanishes, and that concerns the fact that Edward, as I recall, shipped an enormous amount of Scottish material down to England, and it may be that there was a lot of unique material that went down to England, and so it just isn't available for Scots to investigate. And I do wonder, on the one hand, whether there may have been a certain amount of Brus literature in the stuff that went south. And if one wants a reason as to why that material went south, one thing we do know about Edward is that he had a very lively interest in his own image, in the representation of the dear self. I presume he was thinking not only for political reasons for the present, but also his status in more historical terms, in which case, of course, he would wish to annihilate those bits of material that do not show him up in the best possible light. And in particular, if there was Scottish material that raised serious questions about the legitimacy of his rule of Scotland as if it was just a northern province of England. So I see why there may be an argument to explain why stuff would head south from Scotland to England. But on the other hand, if that is what happened, then, since on the whole it's my impression that England is a safer place in the Middle Ages for manuscripts to be than Scotland is, because the Scots were not annihilating English manuscripts on the whole, but the English were annihilating Scots. A question would be why the materials on Brus, if they had been shipped south, have not been discovered and not made use of. And no, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. My goodness, yes. I'll work backwards if that's okay, and if I forget the first bit, I'm sure you'll remind me. Yes, I mean, the shipping of material in bulk, shall we say, that was 1296, so that was before Brus had started his career, shall we say, as national liberator. But your point about Edward I and his sensitivity to the presentation of the past in written record is indeed well made, because it's well known that when he arrived, this is the point where he finally allowed the issue of the Scottish succession to rise to the top of his agenda, and he after the extinction of the royal line in 1290. So he arrived at Norham, right on the border, in May 1291, and he obviously by that stage made up his mind that he was going to spring on the Scots the news that he wasn't coming as a friendly neighbour to arbitrate between the two main claimants, but he was coming as their sovereign to judge who he should infect with the kingdom. And in the course of that, he decided it would be a good idea to back up his a priori idea of his superiority over Scotland, and so English chroniclers were asked, the monasteries across the land were advised to go and find out what they could from their chronicles and report back to Edward I. And Archie Duncan has reconstructed through the detailed English records of how much oatmeal was consumed by the horses, but how the passage of these people, these monks or their emissaries delivering their chronicles, how that all happened. And much of this has survived, the report that was compiled by this in this way. So it might be thought, you see, that if Edward I sort of then subsequently discovered Scottish chronicles saying different things, that he might take a dim view of this and indeed suppress them. And indeed, certainly since Walter Bower's day, he was writing in the 1440s, Edward I indeed was roundly blamed for the lack of material that was available on earlier Scottish history. One interesting sidelight on this, however, is the Chronicle of Melrose. That is our main source written in Scotland during the late 12th and most of the 13th century. This survives uniquely as the manuscript that the scribes actually wrote on over, well, more than a century. And it survives because it ended up in England. And interestingly enough, when you look at it, you'll see that there were certain statements that would have been very distressing from a Scottish point of view. For example, Malcolm III becoming the man of William the Conqueror when they met at Abernethy in 1072. And this is that the offending words "became as man" have been scraped away. And my theory is that the monks of Melrose, when they heard that Edward, just down the road in Norham, was taking an active interest in chronicles, looked at their chronicle and thought, "Oh, horror, this is actually said that gave grist to Edward I's mill." So they duly got rid of it. My point, though, is that had Edward I done a sweep up of chronicles, you might expect this and many other Scottish chronicles to have ended up in English government archives, the best preserved in Europe, and we would have lots to play with. They don't. The Chronicle of Melrose looks like it was just taken away, a bit of sort of private enterprise by somebody, and it ended up in a very obscure monastery in the Fens, where it lurked until it was recovered. The main issue we're talking about then, to get to the other points of your question, is about the pattern of survival. Why does so little survive in Scotland compared to Wales, compared to England? And here I think, well, if we're thinking about monastic chronicles and so on, I think the main point is the different way the Reformation happened. In England, it was, all over in a couple of years. As for the dissolution of monasteries, I'm really talking about. The monasteries were dissolved over a couple of years by royal fiat, and in preparation for that catastrophe, Henry VIII charged John Leland, an eminent antiquary, to go round monasteries selecting the best manuscripts for the king's own personal collection, as a result of which a vast amount, including the Chronicle of Melrose, survives today in the British Library. In Scotland there was no dissolution of the monasteries, of course. The monasteries were just allowed to fizzle out, and in the absence of any antiquarian interest at that point in the 16th century, it seems to me that most likely that, well, the stuff was of no interest to anybody anymore, and it was just allowed to moulder away. The material that was preserved was the material relating to property, so charters and cartularies were kept because the people who had assumed the lands that had belonged to the monasteries had a natural interest in that. But at that point, there wasn't the sort of Scottish antiquarian movement which would have preserved so many of the manuscripts that we know must have existed at this time. It means, sad to say, people like Balfour of Den Mill, who he lived in the first half of the 17th century. He is, I suppose, one of our main antiquaries, and his record is sadly patchy. He's not done us many favours, whereas in England, and indeed in Wales, antiquarians were a bit more thorough and a bit quicker off the mark, and I think that's how so much more stuff survives. To pick up where you began, which was Robert Bruce's half Gallic and so on, actually he was, you could say, completely Gallic, in the sense that he would have been able to operate in Gaelic society as good as anybody else was able to operate, precisely for the reason that you said, as Earl of Carrick. And so, although there's not a shred of evidence directly for this claim, I would nonetheless claim there must have been the kind of poetry written to him for his years in Gaelic that any other leading person in the Gaelic world would have expected, the sort of eulogistic poetry that survives in such profusion in Wales and in Ireland and later on in Gaelic Scotland.
Thank you very much for that. I certainly feel an educated man in this field. While you've been giving this answer, I've been wondering about what you're counting as literature about Brus. There's quite a lot of sorts of stuff that you've mentioned. We've heard about chronicles, and we've heard about annals, the Gesta Annalia, and we've heard about poetry in Latin, and we've heard about the Scots material, and we've even heard about an ecclesiastical calendar. And my first thought was, at this point we've really run out of possibilities. But then another thought occurred to me on account of something that I've been working on quite a lot lately, and that's the declaration of the clergy. Because in the declaration of the clergy, we're actually talk quite a lot about Brus, about his success, his kingly successes. He was a man who could be entrusted with the defence of the realm. We're told that he's a man who possesses the cardinal virtues, has got the kind of practical knowledge that you need in order to run a country. And of course we're also told something about the bloodline, as it were, that this is a man who has got legitimacy also in respect of his ancestry, at least going back to his grandfather. And I wonder whether you'd like to comment on this, on the declaration of the clergy and other such declarations that I think may have been around, in respect of them being Scottish literature. I don't know whether such a declaration might be included in the canon of Scottish literature, though personally I'm really rather broad-minded about these things and wouldn't on conceptual grounds object to that at all. But you didn't say anything about that aspect of material on Brus, and I wonder whether you had some, as it were, ideological reason for doing this.
Well, not at all, indeed. You're absolutely right. I stand corrected. How can we not regard, particularly the Declaration of Arbroath, as literature, given the highly stylized prose with which it was written? Yes, I suppose I was playing a gambit here and trying to take the Welsh on in their own territory, rather than, which of course they beat us with repeatedly and soundly as far as the wonderful poetry is concerned, rather than the, shall we say, government-produced material. But I can see exactly what I could have done, which is to say, okay, we don't have the eulogistic poetry which gives us that access to what they were saying in the court to the ears of the leading men, of the rulers themselves, but we do have the Declaration of Arbroath and the Declaration of the Clergy. I suppose the only sort of thing that makes it slightly different from what I've talked about is that, at least it's assumed, and I have no reason to doubt this, that when we read things like the Declaration of the Clergy, the Declaration of Arbroath, in a sense we are reading slightly more directly than maybe we might imagine the ideas of the great man himself, Robert Brus. He's not the author in a conventional sense, but it's inconceivable that he wouldn't have had a significant input into these products. However, I can see sort of the weakness in my attempt to sort of wriggle out of my failure to mention these pieces and claiming that the eulogistic poetry is so very different because in this sense the eulogistic poetry isn't necessarily so different. There is, the whole point is that the poet is aware of their patron's own point of view, so that there is also that direct connect. That indeed what gives a lot of it its power and interest as a historical source. It gives us access indeed to the mind of the patron as well. So I have to confess I've just dug myself a complete hole and I've failed to get out of it entirely. So there we are.
Well, I'm minded to say that some passages in the Declaration of the Clergy are quite lyrical, and you could almost treat them as poetry. When he does speak about the virtues of Brus and his entitlement to the name of king in virtue of all these things that he's done, there's a bit of poetic lift-off here, and it's not just plain common or garden prose. Some of it indeed is very beautiful Latin. So as I say, I'd be minded to include that in the canon of Scottish literature if I had a choice. Anyway, I've got other questions in mind, but I think I would. I've said enough, more than enough, you may think, and I would open this up to the audience. There is a roving mic. Yes, down in the bottom corner.
I'm Jewel, Duchess of Hamilton, and I'd like to know your source to know when the Pope recognised him as king. Because I thought it was 2 days after he was dead, when Murray was actually in France. I didn't know it was during his lifetime.
Yes, there are two parts. This one is when because remember the Pope rather tried to square him out of the list by just referring to the man that calls himself ruler of Scotland, Robert Brus that calls himself, and eventually realised that if he was going to get the letters read at all, he was going to have to acknowledge that Robert Brus is a little more significant than that. But you're right. The main document, if you like, is the bull which gives the right of coronation and anointment to Robert Brus and subsequent, and that was indeed very poignantly wasn't actually signed off until, unbeknown to the Pope, the king had died.
It was 5 days later or 6 days.
It was very close. That's right, exactly.
I think with messengers they could have got through.
Oh no, not in a few days. No.
Not in 6 days.
No,
7 days.
I doubt it. I doubt it. So I think it's very, very poignant because, let's face it, kings of Scots had been trying to achieve coronation and anointment possibly since 1221-2, certainly since 1250, and here we were. Robert Brus had achieved that which no other king of Scots had managed to achieve, and actually he'd died just a few days before.
Still answer my question. He was still excommunicated until after his death. My sources that I have managed to find don't give any lifting of that excommunication until Murray's visit.
Well, he was I talked about these manuscripts which have John of Thornton's Chronicles and Guested and Earlier and all sorts of things attached to it. They have all sorts of other things attached to it too. And one of them, and that's the manuscripts in Trinity College Dublin, has, I think it's the only source for this, the absolution from the Pope for the appalling killing of John Comyn in Dumfries. That's 1309 or 10. There are people in this room who know better than I do.
That was Clement still. You've got Pope John subsequently did not recognise him after the Treaty of Barbour.
The Declaration of Barbour.
Yeah. The Declaration of Barbour.
Yes.
There's no recognition of him after that, and that's why they continued to fight. And he's still excommunicated. I mean, I've looked and looked for documents.
Yes.
And I can't find them, and I would like to know your source in which you're saying that he was.
Well, I've explained the sources, and that is the fact that I explained there were two. I don't want to repeat myself. That there's soft sources and hard sources. There's a soft stuff which is saying that actually using the title and recognising him in that sense, and then the hard source, which is the bull which actually gave him coronation ointment, and you really can't do that to somebody that you think is excommunicated.
May I butt in on this conversation, which I think might go on for quite some time otherwise, but there'll be an opportunity afterwards to speak. Question? Yes, sir.
Ask a question that my name is Ad Patel. I've got a question about perhaps snippets of pro-Brus literature that might lie hidden in English sources. I think there are some prose brutes in English, probably 15th century, that have snippets of verse, mainly taunting the English. It's snippets like, you English ladies, you're going to be weeping for quite a long time because your lovers are all dead, killed at Bannockburn. I can't claim that this is Brus material, but there are snippets about that might be of interest. And I don't know how well known that is.
No, that sounds wonderful. That would be definitely worth.
I'll pass you a reference.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, we've heard a lot about what the people at the top of the tree were thinking at the time. What about those thousands who were at the bottom? What were they thinking about what was going on?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. And of course, there's no literature that expresses their point of view directly. So all we can do is look at their actions, if you like, and even then we can only see their actions as reported by other people. And Barbour's Brus is one of the most exciting sources in that regard, because what you find is, and the incidents will be well known to many of you, I'm sure, is occasions where people, shall we say, the middling sorts, resort to self-help in order to dispose of English garrisons. So, to cut a long story short, you can put together a scenario where there is at least a significant body of people out there who take a patriotic view, who are committed to the idea of Scottish independence, and are there making the necessary sacrifices from the beginning in 1296 all the way through. Indeed, one very striking piece of secondary literature is in Professor Barrow's Anglo-Norman era. I think it's towards the beginning of the last chapter. Talks about those individuals who, this is after Edward I, or during Edward I's invasion of 1296, when the Scottish cause was utterly hopeless. Nonetheless, these individuals who, in the greater scheme of things, are nobodies, decided that they would take up arms, or indeed, in one case, excommunicate Edward I, knowing that this was not exactly going to do them any good whatsoever. So there is that. There is, shall we say, we can pick up a sort of strain of patriotism, certainly a commitment to Scottish independence, but that's not necessarily going to be the complete picture. And I think, the bit, for example, which I quoted from the obituary of Andrew Murray when he died in 1338, reminds us that there was a lot of involuntary suffering as well, shall we say, that, although there are plenty of examples of people making the decision of their own volition to make their contribution to the cause of independence, there are many others who suffered appallingly just because of the way things were done in those days, and we can guess at least that they might have had a different view of Scottish independence. Finally, I suppose it's worth recalling that in the period when the English government began to really sort of begin to put down roots, that is after the conquest of February 1304 and through to the Brus's rising in March 1306, February-March 1306, you do get certain things turning up in the English government records, such as petitions from the men of Galloway who want to, have an improvement in their lot. They want a change in the, shall we say, the administration of justice, which suggests that, and there are freeholders also. There's a petition which I vaguely remember, but I'm afraid I can't recover from my memory right now. Things like that, which suggest that there would have been issues which clearly, from certain perspectives of people out there, particular groups maybe in particular places, would have seen them actually welcome the idea, or at least see the government by Edward I as an opportunity to improve their lot. So it's bound to be a complicated picture.
Questions for... Yes, sir. Second floor.
What was Barbour's sources then? I mean, were they purely oral? I mean, were there written documents which he had access to, which have now disappeared? I mean, is this clear from his poetry or not?
That's a very good question, and indeed much disputed territory. One way to look at the pro-Brus material that got landed into the source I was talking about would be to take that as evidence for a sort of narrative that had already formed, which Barbour was elaborating. Obviously, it can't have been anything near the same scope as Barbour's own work. So, you can fumble around there to try and get some real sense of the written material that might have been, that he might have worked on. Otherwise, you're really thrown back, I think, largely on examining the piece itself. And I know that there are people who have subjected this to all sorts of different kinds of treatment, and indeed convinced themselves that there's more than one author involved, and so on and so forth. So it is all fairly tricky. The person who's really gone into this in the greatest detail, of course, is Professor Duncan in his introduction to his edition and translation of Barbour's Brus. So I'm afraid I'm going to be very lame and refer you to him, I'm afraid, for further elucidation.
Yes, the last question.
Catherine Smith, supplementary to that last question. In the 19th century, we have Pauli doing the great biography of King Alfred, starting by stating, since we know nothing about this man, we can write as much as we like about him as a model of a patriot in order to raise interest in the unification of Germany. Is there any comparison possible with Barbour's writing of the Brus?
Yes, no, that's a very, very intriguing thought. I mean, I don't. I think it would be pushing this too far to think of Barbour just taking a completely blank canvas and producing something like that. He was, after all, writing this for the descendants of some of the main figures, most notably the son of the good Sir James would have been there to hear what was being said about his father. There's bound to have been lots and lots of stories of one sort or another. Exactly what they were, difficult to track down. What also, I find very striking about Barbour's Brus is, as I sort of said very briefly, is shall we say, the sophistication of its way of presenting the material. It's not all about goodies and baddies in the way that Blind Harry's Wallace tends to be. It's much more cut and dried about who's on what side. There's real ambiguities there, complexities. People who are very, very significant, not least the king himself, is given a more rounded personality. There are things, mistakes that he has made, the heirship of Buchan, and all those innocent people he killed are there haunting him in his last days. For example, it's all described very graphically and poignantly. So it reads as to me anyway, as something that's shall we say, in touch with all sorts of realities there, rather than just being a sort of propaganda effort. I think if it was to be more of a propaganda effort, you might end up something more like Blind Harry's Wallace, actually, which leads us on to another story altogether, of course, which I'll run away from, if you don't mind.
I'll now ask Professor McQueen to close this part of the meeting.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you very much also, Davy. I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject. All the best historical subjects lack evidence, and thus open up endless fields of inquiry. But Davy is one of the great experts, actually, at gleaning out of the exiguous sources so much more. And those of you who are familiar with his work over the years, I think we'll have observed two things tonight. One, that he continues to be this sifter, this careful sifter of the material, but also he's moved on in a technical sense, because in my early exposure to his lectures, he used to have overhead projection facilities, which he flipped the transparencies over, and suddenly all was clear at the very end of what he was doing. Now he's using different colours in PowerPoint. So all as usual, wonderfully clear and lucid, and some very penetrating, if I may say so, questions from Alexander to get the audience juices flowing, and questions that then came from the audience were all, as Davy repeatedly said, very good ones, i.e. almost impossible to answer. So I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking them for their splendid efforts in getting our evening off to such a marvellous start. Thank you very much.